Welcome to week 4, video 4 for PSC 355. And in this video, we're going to discuss the political risks to multinational corporations. So the central question here is, what risks do firms face when expanding production abroad? So foreign direct investment is different from other investment. It involves acquiring or creating production facilities in foreign countries. These investments are long-term in nature. You can't move that investment without considerable cost. It's very different from what we would call portfolio capital flows or liquid capital flows. Things like buying a stock in a foreign stock market or even lending money to a foreign corporation. These are investments that can be moved in and out of a country very quickly if conditions change. But foreign direct investment's different. You're really locking yourself in to a long-term investment. And so scholars have argued that foreign direct investments exhibit something called the obsolescing bargain. The obsolescing bargain, which is that once a firm undertakes FDI, the host country government now has increased bargaining power. That government has an incentive to change the terms of the initial agreement to reap an increased share of the benefits, right? So you've invested millions of dollars, you've set up shop in that foreign country, and now the government could come back to you and conceivably say, hey, look, so we want to change the deal. Host country governments could affect the value of a firm's investment in a number of ways. The most extreme way would be through expropriation, which you've read about in your text this week, and that is when a government seizes ownership of the investment from the firm completely outright, right? So you might just literally see a government swoop in and say, you don't own this factory anymore, the state owns it. And that's always something and a risk that an investment faces. A second possible change is requiring joint ventures. It's kind of a halfway between expropriation and doing nothing. In this case, you might force that foreign firm to grant part ownership of the investment to a local firm, which will jointly own or manage the production facility. So you might come in and say, hey, 50% share of your investment now has to go to this local firm, and you've got to bring them in as a partner. Governments may change the rules by adding local content requirements. That would be a situation where you might require the firm to buy inputs from local producers. Maybe at the initial investment, those requirements weren't in place, but at a later date, the state might come in and say, you know, you've got to use, for instance, all of your cotton for your shirts that you're producing here from our local cattle, or excuse me, our local sheep farmers or our local cotton producers, etc. When it comes to smaller revisions, things like changes in the tax code, environmental rules and regulations, labor and trade policies, all of these can change the value of the investment by, for instance, raising taxes on the firm or making it more costly to deal with disposing of waste, etc., etc. And so again, the key thing here is because investments are long-term, the obsolescing bargain threatens the long-term value of that investment. In your text this week, you're going to read about this Venezuelan example, and I want you to make sure you read it carefully. But it talks about how in the early 1980s, Venezuela opened up its oil sector to foreign investment. The government had hoped that foreign firms would bring in their specialties and production know-how to boost oil production and exports. And by 1996, Venezuela was the world's most attractive location for oil sector FDI. It was viewed as very low risk, but in 1999, Hugo Chavez was elected president, and he worked through state-owned oil company PDV and basically forced these foreign firms to transform local affiliates into joint ventures. PDV gained about a 60% controlling interest in these ventures, and foreign firms lost an estimated $3.7 billion in income over the life of those investments because of that expropriation and that forced joint ventureship. This clip here will highlight some of the things that occurred when Chavez was in power.
Al Jazeera reports that Venezuela has nationalized a fleet of oil rigs owned by a U.S.-based company, which had been shut down in a dispute over payments. In a statement, the Venezuelan government said that seizing control of the 11 rigs was the only way to get them restarted after a year of idleness. The move comes as Hugo Chavez, Venezuela's socialist president, pushes ahead with a policy of energy nationalization as he seeks to expand the state's role in the economy. He's also taken over assets in telecommunications, power, steel, and banking. The fleet of oil rigs belonging to Oklahoma-based energy firm Helmerich and Payne have been idled for months.
So that gave you a sense of what Chavez did when he was in power and how the Helmerich and Payne company that had invested in that oil rig lost all the future revenues from that rig that it had spent millions of dollars creating in Venezuela. And so we can see this as a potent example of political risks facing firms. So Chavez significantly changed how income was distributed between that foreign oil company and the Venezuelan state. Essentially, right, he kept some of that profits, and in the case of Helmerich and Payne, all of the profits from that investment for the Venezuelan state. He capitalized, Chavez did, on two factors to successfully redistribute income towards the state and away from these firms. First, because oil is not evenly distributed across the world, oil companies have few alternatives to Venezuela. There aren't many countries that have the type of oil resources that Venezuela does. So for Chavez, you could even risk hurting your reputation because in the long run, firms are still going to have to come back there if they want to get access to oil. And second, he was benefiting from the process, from the fact that his predecessors had been open to investment. You wouldn't have been able to take advantage of the obsolescing bargain had those companies not poured and invested billions over the preceding decade in the first place. So that was a specific advantage to Chavez as well.